Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Sunday starter here at the Sonoma Avenue Church of Christ. Let's talk for a minute about expectation versus reality. Sometimes we have great expectations for how good or wonderful something is going to be, but then when we experience that thing in the real world, it does not live up to those expectations. Now, nowhere may this be more prevalent than in the realm of pictures of food on a menu versus the actual food that you get. For example, this is a picture of a McDonald's Big Mac taken by someone in the McDonald's PR department. I don't know about you, but I have never seen a Big Mac that looks like that in the wild. I'm not even sure that's real food. But if you saw this picture and had never had a Big Mac before, your expectation would be that this is the product you would get if you ordered it. Now, reality is a little bit different. This picture represents a real-life Big Mac. Now look, honestly, it's a hamburger. It shouldn't look perfect, but couldn't things be stacked a little bit more precisely? Shouldn't I be able to tell kind of what level it is and what's on that level? Is that asking too much, or is that just my OCD kicking in? The reality is that a Big Mac is very disappointing when it is compared to the image of what they say a Big Mac will be. And we experience this kind of expectation versus reality letdown in all different corners of our life. Movies that we think are going to be awesome, or books or TV shows or any sort of thing. We have expectations for greatness or for something really wonderful, and when those expectations are not met, we find ourselves being disappointed and let down. Now, Jesus himself had an image problem. I know that seems weird, but the problem did not just exist in those who disagreed with him and wanted him dead. They clearly thought he was something that he wasn't. But the problem also existed in the minds of those who knew him most intimately and who spent the most time with him. There was an image problem. Their expectation did not match reality. But this was not Jesus' fault. Time and time again, Jesus had told his disciples what his mission was on this earth and what was going to happen. He didn't keep anything hidden from them, and time again, they let his words bounce off of their ideas of how they thought things should be. Take a look at this passage from Mark chapter 8, verses 31 through 33. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." You see the problem, don't you? Peter had an expectation for what he thought the future was going to be. The image he had built up in his mind was a glorious one. Jesus as the conquering hero, the one who would restore greatness to the nation of Israel, the one who would claim the throne of God once and for all. The problem was that Peter's expectation of how things were going to go did not fall in line with the reality of what God was doing and the path that Jesus was taking. And this is why Peter could not wrap his mind around the words that were coming out of Jesus' mouth. Because in Peter's mind, rejection and death were not a part of the story. It was going to be victory. So Peter felt like he had to tell Jesus that Jesus had it wrong. And he rebuked Jesus, correcting him, putting him back in his place, reminding him of what it was that God really wanted to do in the kingdom. And I can only assume educating Jesus about what was to come and how God was going to make all of this work. And then, in what I can only consider the harshest of words, in words that had to have broken Peter's heart, Jesus told Peter how it was. "Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Now, there are a few things that we need to immediately recognize from these words of Jesus. First of all, if your plans do not match up with God's plans, then the voice that you are listening to is a voice that is speaking against God. Jesus calls it Satan. I think that this is a good and necessary lesson for me, because there are times when I consider some teachings of Jesus and I feel like my half-cooked response is good enough for him, as if Jesus doesn't know when I'm giving him a half-cooked response, as if Jesus doesn't know when I'm watering things down or when I'm putting my own interests into the picture. As we saw last week, we can only be the disciple of one teacher. And Jesus tells us here that either that teacher is him, and by extension God, or it is not. And if it's not, then it is someone who is against God that is having this influence in our lives. But secondly, and this is actually the worst part of it for me, the thing that really derailed Peter was that he had human concerns at heart. What does that mean? It means that the concerns that told Peter that Jesus could not be correct about this plan of God were average, normal human concerns. And because Peter chose to listen to those human concerns, he in turn was not listening to Jesus. Instead, he was listening to the one who would challenge the plans that God had for Jesus. And so Jesus tells him to get behind him, because he is not listening to God. He is listening to Satan by playing into his own human desires. We need to let this sink in for a moment. I wonder if Jesus told us what his plan was for our lives in this world, if we would argue with him. I wonder if we would tell him that he is wrong. I wonder if we would tell him what the plan should be and explain to him how God really wanted to be for us. And then I wonder what Jesus will call us. See, the thing is, I am so convicted by this passage because it makes me consider how often I allow things that I think are important to become in my own mind as important as the mission of the kingdom. And it tells me that sometimes I confuse the things that I want for the things that God wants, when God may want something completely different, when God may want something that I don't want. Have I confused the American dream or my own personal idea of how things should be for the actual goals of the kingdom and passed them off as God's own ideas? Have I changed the goals of the kingdom to fit the way that I think things should go? Are the things that are important to me the same things that are important to Jesus? I don't know the answer to all of those questions, but I know that I'm not going to like a lot of them. Yet there is a moment of catharsis and hope here. Maybe the first step for me is that I need to recognize that even though I have been a Christian for a long time, there is still a war going on inside of me. And that war is not just sin versus the redemption of God, or me choosing to do good things or choosing to do bad things. This war gets down to the heart of my own interests, my perception versus reality. What I want may not be what God wants. Maybe I am confusing my desires for kingdom desires. But here's why this becomes a moment of catharsis for me, is that I don't think I can change my heart or change my desires to match God's desires if I am not first aware of where I am cutting corners and where I am watering down the kingdom goals to match my own goals. I have to see that if I'm going to change and if I'm going to do this in the way that God wants me to. And there's good news. God still carries out his plans whether we agree with those plans or not. But his words to us are challenging. For right after this, Jesus turns to the crowd and he says, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it." Man, I'm not sure how my own self-interests can have any voice when Jesus tells me I need to lose my life. Do you want to hear more? Well, then join us on Sunday.